This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
I've solved it. I've been staring at it for a couple of weeks now. Actually, since the 7 bins. Do you remember 7 bins Sunak? Announcing that they were going to get rid of the requirement for you to have 7 bins that you haven't got. And then announcing, I think it was Claire Coutinho, who was on with Nick earlier today, she weighed in on this one and got completely humiliated, quite rightly, by Sophie Ridge on Sky News, because she was talking about the abolition of a meat tax that didn't exist. And I was trying to work out what was going on. I've been trying to sort of pin down why outwardly sensible people would ally themselves with such utter absurdity. And of course, when you come to Suella Braverman, which we will sadly have to do in a moment, you can drop the words outwardly sensible and instead replace them with absolutely crazy. But what's the plan? Is there a plan? How many times have we sat here together of a morning and essentially pontificated on whether or not we are observing utterly unplotted chaos or failing to appreciate the secret, possibly sinister master plan that underpins the actions of a government? But I know what it is. And I've even got a pithy little catchphrase to describe it. And I think it fits almost everything that's going on. Target first, policy second. Right, let me talk you through it, okay? So we'll start with the 7 bins and the meat tax. So after that curious victory in Uxbridge, which many people attributed to a successful propaganda campaign completely misrepresenting the ultra-low emission zone, as we've seen subsequently, huge numbers of people who thought that they were going to be affected by it are not, which is why no one's talking about it anymore. 97% drop, I think, in social media chatter. But Tories are desperate. So actually, we'll go even further back. The cupboard is bare. You've been in power for 13 years. It's almost impossible to cast yourself as an agent of change or to cast yourself as entirely unconnected to any bad things that are currently happening. You've had 13 years to sort out and then put whatever your favourite policy is in the space that follows those words. You've had 13 years to sort out the NHS. You've had 13 years to sort out growth. You've had 13 years to sort out the economy. You've had 13 years to sort out homelessness. You've had 13 years to sort out waterways. You've had 13 years to sort out energy costs. You've had 13 years. Now, some of this stuff, arguably, governments can't sort out. But then that goes off the table immediately because it shouldn't be a subject of policy making anyway. So you've been in power for 13 years. Most people are, I think it's fair to say, unless you're very, very rich or you've got a COVID contract, most people are not very impressed by the way their lives have gone or the role that government has played in their lives of late. And the people who've been in power for 13 years have little choice but to try to disassociate themselves from it. It's why I think some people still trying to pull up, what's his name, Hands, is it Greg Hands, Conservative Party chairman, still trying to resurrect that old note that Liam Byrne left in the Treasury about there not being any money left. I mean, you might as well tattoo desperate across your forehead if you're going to be doing stuff like that. So the cupboard is completely bare. You can't really announce anything for 2 reasons. There's nothing left to announce, except perhaps policies designed to undo damage done by policies previously introduced by your own party, in which the current Prime Minister, of course, was until relatively recently Chancellor of the Exchequer. So do you see the madness? You see the problem? We've got to announce meaningful change. Meaningful change to what? Meaningful change to the state of the nation. What, you mean the nation you've been governing for 13 years? Oh, yeah. We've got a bit of a problem there. So what can they do instead? The cupboard is bare. Worse than bare, actually. The cupboard contains pretty irrefutable evidence that the people who've been in charge of the country for 13 years are probably, at least in large part, responsible for the state of the country after 13 years. Well, we're pretty good at hate, aren't we? You know, we've been essentially remoulded in the style of Nigel Farage. So hate politics, that's probably our best chance of holding on to the base. As long as Farage doesn't pop up again to the right of the right of the right of the party, then our best chance of avoiding electoral oblivion next year is probably to cling like Billy-O to the sort of far-right sympathising rump of our own party, or at least the hate-filled rump, the easily manipulated, the people that can be persuaded that inequality is not caused by epic misdistribution of wealth, it's caused by Polish lorry drivers, or the people who can be persuaded that the state of the economy is not a consequence of mismanagement and false priorities, it is instead a consequence of desperate souls coming over the channel in dinghies. You're the kind of people that if we give them some red meat to gnaw on, then as soon as they've put their teeth in, they'll be gnawing away like there's nobody's business. So target first, policy second. You can almost imagine them sitting around a table and saying, who do they hate? And someone puts their hand up and says, they hate the eco-warriors at the moment. Just have a look at the Daily Mail or some other sort of right-wing outlet. Who do they? Oh, they hate the eco. All right, what can we do as a policy that shows them that we share their hatred of eco warriors? Well, first of all, we'll bring in policies that make it very hard for them to protest, which is quite good. But that, of course, robs us of the media hit of them actually protesting. So you need them to be above the parapet in order to be able to throw rotten tomatoes at them. But unfortunately, we've kind of banned them from putting their heads above the parapet. So we've got a bit of a tricky bit there. I know. Let's say that we're getting rid of things that the eco-warriors wanted. Okay, that's a good idea. What can we get rid of that the eco-warriors wanted? Well, I suppose we could promise to get rid of the ultra-low emission zone, couldn't we? Yeah, okay, that's good. That could be, if you're, a desperate London mayoral candidate, you could probably build a campaign around that and just hope that it doesn't continue to disappear into the reeds as an issue that the population is actually cross about. Okay, I've got a better idea. Why don't we announce that we're getting rid of things that the eco-warriors wanted, even though they don't actually exist? Tell me more about that, Tristram. Well, how about a meat tax? Let's tell them there's a tax on meat, but we are the people to get rid of it. Yeah, do you know what? I think this could... No. And then someone else at the table goes, there's no way they're going to fall for absolute crapola like that. And someone else at the table goes, hello, can I introduce you to Brexit? And Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, these people will fall for anything if we package it right and sign up all the client journalists. So what else could we do? We're going to abolish a meat tax. That doesn't exist. How about bins? People don't like recycling. Or eco-warriors really like recycling. So let's attack recycling. Yeah, okay. So I, Rishi Sunak, am going to abolish the rule that says you need 7 bins. I'm also going to abolish the meat tax. Hooray, hooray, hooray. So do you see what I mean? Target first, policy second. Policy nonsense doesn't matter, because if people hate the target enough, they'll cheer the policy. What do we come to next? Front page of the Daily Telegraph today. Benefits claimants, yes! Benefits claimants back on the front page. Fantastic. Hello, political editor, Daily Telegraph. Yes, Downing Street here. Do you think you could put benefits claimants back on the front page tomorrow? We're a little bit desperate. Absolutely no problem at all. Have you got a policy, sir? Yes. We're checking their bank accounts every week to see whether they've got any savings. Splendid idea. Any idea how much money that's going to save? Absolutely no clue whatsoever. It's a completely invented policy. How on earth could we possibly cost it? Just stick 500 million quid in the story. Okay, so it's going to save 500 million pounds over 5 years. Off the top of my head, that's about 45 to 50 years to claw back some of the money you gave away during COVID frauds. Magnificent, but you see, it targets benefits claimants. Target first, policy second. Policy nonsense. Doesn't matter, because if you hate benefits claimants enough, then this policy is going to work for you. We'll get on a little later today to a story that makes the saga of Keir Starmer's disappearing poppy look almost sensible. Problems or fears that Remembrance Day services or Remembrance Day commemorations may be disrupted exist entirely in the imaginations of people who target first, policy second, people marching in solidarity with Palestinians, or, broadly speaking, and a lot of people there will be Muslims. The base that we're appealing to, they don't like Muslims. Let's do something that makes Muslims look bad and claim that there are concerns that a Remembrance Day commemoration may be disrupted by a pro-Palestinian solidarity march, and sort of gloss quickly over the fact that Remembrance Sunday is on Sunday and the pro-Palestinian march is on Saturday. So Armistice Day is on Saturday. There will be some commemorations, but generally speaking, what they're trying to do is drum up the idea that a march taking place on Saturday is going to somehow disrupt a ceremony taking place on Sunday. Target Muslims. Policy, police should do more, or let's move it to Balham. I don't know. But mission accomplished. Target identified. Policy announced. Rubbish policy. And that brings us inevitably, inexorably to Suella Braverman, who has made it clear over the last couple of days that the best way to get rid of the problem of people sleeping in tents is to ban tents. And the reason I've tried to be funny for the last 10 minutes is because that is a story that makes me want to cry. I cannot believe how low our country has been brought, that a Home Secretary thinks that she can appeal to her base, quite possibly correctly, by attacking homeless people and promising to make their lives even worse than they are already. Nobody likes to see tents on the streets of London. Nobody ever does, in fact, when Labour are in power. The successful reduction in homelessness during the last Labour government was a triumph for the ages. Homelessness always goes up under the Tories. When I moved to London in the early 1990s, Lincoln's Inn Field, which is a beautiful Georgian square in the sort of Holborn region of the capital, was a shanty town. I couldn't believe it. I'd led a relatively sheltered life from sort of boarding school, and then a rather less sheltered life during a brief sojourn in Chorlton-cum-Hardy, living in a shared house. But I arrived in London very wet behind the ears, and I couldn't quite believe that on the doorstep of the London School of Economics was what could only be described as a shanty town, where people weren't just living in tents, they were living in makeshift shacks made out of pallets and things like that. That, of course, was after 12, 13 years of Tory rule. Do you see a theme? I just said that was after 13 years of Tory rule. There was a shanty town in the middle of London. And now, after 13 years of Tory rule, we're seeing tents springing up in our cities and on our streets and in towns up and down the country. And what does the Tory Home Secretary think would be the best solution to the problem of people sleeping in tents? She wants to ban tents. Target, homeless. Policy, ban tents. Policy is nonsense, but if people hate the target enough, then they'll cheer it to the rafters. As long as you can ensure that they'll forget that normally when you're slagging off refugees, you like to say that we should be looking after our homeless veterans instead. You just got to, as long as you can keep that little bit of the rhetoric of bile in the background, as long as nobody reminds you that normally when they're coming up with reasons to turn the British population against desperate refugees, the false analogy that they use is homeless military veterans. So they like to say, why aren't we helping our own? Why aren't we helping the homeless military veterans on the street instead of putting these refugees up in 17-star hotels? So she's possibly misstepped slightly on this, but I noticed that she very quickly came out and used the word foreigner to describe the people sleeping in tents, an observation for which she has absolutely no basis whatsoever. There will be people of every background sleeping on the streets at the moment. That's how homelessness works. That's what happens when the safety net is so threadbare and moth-eaten that people will fall through it without barely noticing it exists. But congratulations. You now live in a country where the Home Secretary thinks homelessness is a lifestyle choice. I bet you didn't think you were going to wake up here last week, did you? A country where one of the holders of the 4 great offices of state in our wonderful country thinks that homelessness is a lifestyle choice. 16 minutes after 10 is the time. Why does homelessness always go up under the Tories? 0345 6060 973. And to answer that question, you will need to know a little bit about it. And I hope you're out the other side. But if you're not, of course, I need to hear from you as well. What is that? Why does that happen? And I make no apology for doing this. I used to say that I felt bad because it seems a little lazy. But when something completely incomprehensible happens under our noses, I think we ask each other if we can explain it. Can you explain? I've given you my theory, target first, policy second. Who can we attack today? We can't do the refugees again because we did them on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday of last month. So we need to attack someone else today. And we can't do the eco-warriors because 7-bin Sunak's got that sewn up at the moment. So I'm the Home Secretary. I need someone new to attack. let's just do the homeless. Let's just attack the homeless. How are we going to attack the homeless? They've got nothing. Well, some of them have got tents. Bingo. Let's take their tents away. Let's ban the tents. Let's ban charities from giving them tents so that they can, sleep out in the open like good old-fashioned proper tramps, good old-fashioned proper British tramps. They're sleeping out in the open under the stars. Is she evil? Is that a word you can use in this context? Or am I missing something? It wouldn't be the first time. Can you explain why Suella Braverman has decided to target the tents of homeless people as her next policy proposal? Or if you want to step a little bit further back from the fray, can you tell me what's going on? 0345 60 60 973. To be, I suppose, a little bit more substantive, how does it happen? I don't know. I look, in the simplest of terms, I can imagine what needs to happen for you to become homeless, right? Your financial circumstances change, your relationship breaks down, your addiction runs out of control. But there's not really any guarantee that those things are more likely to happen under a Conservative government or under a Labour government. So what is it? What do they do to our society? Because most of us don't know. Most of us are not invested in this side of our world, our shared world. What do the Tories do to our society that causes homelessness to rocket? What changes do they make? What are the policies that bring about these tragedies? Okay? So there's two ways into this. How do you get into a problem like this? 0345 60 60 973. How does Tory party policy inflate homelessness? Okay? And then the second question is, what is Suella Braverman doing? And why is she doing it? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. 0345 60 60 973. It's 20 past 10.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
23 minutes after 10. Even the client journalists at the Daily Telegraph couldn't dress it up any better than this. Homeless people in tents have made a lifestyle choice, says Braverman. I'm going to have to stop saying to you every time you think you've reached rock bottom, along pops someone like Suella Braverman to reveal that there are actually whole new barrels beneath the bottom of the barrel that has been scraped into oblivion. Robert's in Corby. Robert, what made you pick up the phone?
Well, homelessness. Well, it's great to speak to James, by the way. And I've been homeless myself twice in the last 2 years, and the main government haven't had much to do with my situation. But what she said is absolutely outrageous. I had a tent, and without my tent, I wouldn't have no soul. It was something where I could go to and sit in and be okay, have some sort of security, it's massive, and for people to be judging people living in tents is just outrageous. I mean,
What did you think when you heard her words? I mean, just because
I'm flabbergasted.
Yeah,
flabbergasted. It's just, but I dealt with the local council where I live, and nobody gets it until they've done it.
No, I can believe that.
Decisions are made, and I was in 2 hostels and had spinal surgery. 10 days after that, I was put in a tent because I stayed at a friend's house and not in my temporary accommodation.
Who put you in a tent when you say it like
the council? They evicted me from my temporary accommodation.
And as a consequence of that, you had to live in a tent.
I had to go and get a tent, and I had to go back to the old TA centre, actually, where I went and pitched a tent around the back of there, and I stayed there for about 8 weeks, and then I got put into a great place now. Where I'm at, it's a homeless sort of shelter place, and it's phenomenal. It's like the difference between Rolls Royce and Skoda,
Yes, or a soapbox or something, a go-kart made out of old egg boxes. You mentioned an injury there. Is that a large part of how you ended up on the streets?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I was a builder for 27 years, and I had compound fractures in my spine, and in the end, I was unable to use my right leg, and I've had surgery now. So, but yeah,
and there wasn't enough. I mean, the welfare state, or whatever we prefer to call it, didn't catch you. It couldn't keep you afloat. It couldn't keep a roof over your head.
for a year and a half, I was getting something like £300 a month, sometimes less. And I lost my house, lost everything. Lost everything, It was just,
I can't believe you've stayed cheerful. And finally, I have to ask you, why did you make this lifestyle choice, Robert?
It wasn't a lifestyle choice. I didn't want to break my back. I broke my back, and it's been the most traumatic thing I've ever been through in my life. Of course it is. And I've met so many people along the way, And the amount of people that fall through the net with the local authorities, it's appalling, really. It's appalling, People in so much misery being judged and pushed from pillar to post, and it is just an absolute nightmare.
Well, she doesn't think people like you have been in enough misery, does she? Because she wants to take away the 10 that you've just described in very powerful and moving terms. I'm so glad that you're in a better place at the moment, and I'm sure you'll be absolutely back in the game as soon as possible. You've just got that kind of personality, but that, of course, is a gift that not everybody would have, that ability to stay cheerful. I'm not sure I would in your circumstances, so thank you, and thank you for telling the story. How do you arrive at the space? So the rationale, someone was telling me, is very Fox Newsy. So in Fox News, some cities have got real sort of tent communities. People are so poor. But I mean, if you're not going to blame that on, and of course the opioid crisis in America, thankfully so far we have only a very pale reflection of that here. But how do you put the responsibility for homelessness on people like Robert? It wasn't there's a line to take away from today's programme. It wasn't a lifestyle choice to break my back. John's in Brighton. John, what's going on?
Hello. Thanks for taking my call.
You're very welcome.
As I say, long-time listener, first-time caller. What would I like to say? That the comments by Suella are sort of part of what generally appears to be a managed decline in our welfare state, in the way that we treat the most vulnerable people in our community of sort of all ages, really.
And if that decline is being managed, then the consequences of it have to be, disappeared or derided or denigrated? This idea that it's a lifestyle choice takes the government off the hook for 13 years of policies that have increased homelessness.
Yes, and it's part of the art of distraction, of course. Look at those horrible people over there making your world,
your high street
difficult
messy
to look at.
Yes,
exactly. Yes. So I've been working in homelessness, particularly with people sleeping rough, for 19 years now, and on and off.
Yes.
When I first started, I think there was maybe 50,000 people just in England who were homeless,
right.
Whether that be sleeping on sofas or in bed and breakfasts or sleeping rough. And that figure is now at nearly 300,000.
Well,
So
briefly,
when you think,
focusing on rough sleepers, which I appreciate the problem is bigger than that, but I want to keep things quite tight. Focusing on rough sleepers and government policy, why? What is it? What sort of things are introduced that cause the sort of spiralling you describe?
It's not what is introduced; it's what is removed.
Yeah.
So, for example, the idea behind universal credit as a cover-all benefit, which would accommodate everything, as an evidence-driven
Yes.
policy, which could work well, was then taken to pieces, and delays and reductions in the amount paid out happened because ideology takes over empirical research, social science, and common sense.
Is it even ideology? I mean, isn't it as base as I described at the outset? It's just, actually, no, this isn't target first, policy second. This is where can we save some money that will cause the least noise. I know. Let's take funding. We'll take funding away from the most vulnerable.
Well, homelessness, and particularly rough sleeping, has never been something that is that receives real popular support.
No, I know.
In terms of tackling it, it's not like abandoned pets,
or donkeys,
because people feel,
or retired seaside donkeys.
Yeah, people feel ashamed to look at someone who's homeless, because deep down we understand that could be us, and in order to avoid thinking about that too much, we often dehumanize that other person.
And yet, this is a new level of that. Just briefly, because I'm late for the news. When you heard the Suella Braverman comments about lifestyle choices and banning tents, given your background and the work that you've done, what did you think? What came into your head?
Oh, it's a very common refrain. Actually, is a lifestyle choice. Yeah. It is a lifestyle choice, is a common refrain.
And of all the homeless people you've worked with,
to look at it,
the people you've worked with over 19 years, how many of them would you say had ended up homeless as a lifestyle choice?
None whatsoever.
Funny that. 10:31 is the time. Thank you, John. Tom Swartz has your headline.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
I presume that if you are cheering this policy of banning tents currently being used by homeless people, I presume you're too ashamed to say so publicly. But you could text me and talk me through why you're not disgusted by it, outraged by it, because I'd like to think that this won't actually appeal to anybody. I can't quite imagine the constituency of people that will fall for the idea that homelessness is a lifestyle choice. Listen, I've been doing this job long enough to have seen most of the grim underbelly of public opinion, and I know that people can be easily persuaded that all beggars actually live in 5-bedroom mansions with jacuzzis and electric windows, and of course some people begging for money on the streets are not homeless. That is one of an utterly irrefutable observation. So it's an odd thing to do, but if you're living in a tent, then you're not going home to a fancy house, are you? You're not pulling the lead, swinging the lead in that way. You're living in a tent. You're sleeping in a tent, because it is marginally preferable to sleeping under the stars. You might like a hostel place, but they're hard to get, and there are fewer of them. And sometimes, as a homeless chap I befriended a few years ago, who was selling the Big Issue, explained to me, he doesn't want to go into a hostel because they're scary, and quite a lot of the heavy drug users have sort of dominated that environment. That at least is what he told me. So he slept in a subway down by Blackfriars Bridge. That was his birth of choice. And to respond to the existence of people in that position by calling for a banning of tents is beyond my ken. It really is. So I am interested in your answer to the question of what she's actually up to here, because I can't believe that even the most easily manipulated voters are going to fall for this one. I just don't see it. But I could, of course, be wrong. And if you don't want to call me or text me, then maybe tell me about your uncle Bob, who does buy this crud. Who sucks this stuff up? I just don't know anymore. I really don't. I've been following a chap called Chris Wilde on Twitter. He tweets as CCWild79, and he has experienced homelessness and continues to work with the homeless. He's also written a couple of books. I thought I'd just share this with you. That first moment you realise you're homeless, and he was a care leaver who was put in horribly inappropriate accommodation when he was 16, which is the beginning of the spiral into homelessness. That first moment you realise you're homeless and no one is coming to your rescue is a memory deep within your brain. It doesn't go away. That's pretty much the definition of trauma, that, by the way. That's the thing, isn't it? You'd think, what would you think? You'd think there must be some, I mean, who do I call? Where do I ring? Who do I ring? You might think, in my case, I've been paying taxes for 30 years. Who do I call? Where do I go? That moment you realise no one is coming to your rescue. There's a memory deep within your brain. It doesn't go away. Looking through windows, wishing that was you, sat in a warm house with love, embarrassed to ask people for spare change just to get a hot drink or a sausage roll, desperately searching for shelter, scared beyond your worst nightmares, thinking about the best way to end it all. I can personally say that was not a choice. And it isn't a lifestyle choice for hundreds of young people facing that reality every single day. Shame on this government and all the others who think that kind of language is okay. I don't get it. Not today. Most days I get it. And listen, I've nailed the policy, target first, policy second, but are people, desperate homeless people sleeping in tents, really as loathed by the Red Meat Brigade, by the Gaminati, as refugees and general foreigners? Harry's in Purley. Harry, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James. How you doing?
I'm good, mate. What's on your mind?
So, you and I have spoken several times. Hopefully you'll recall. I feel I'm uniquely qualified to speak upon this subject, like the chap you were just talking about.
Yeah.
I was homeless, and then I went back into the sector to work as a support worker and help out those that helped me. And you know, I just felt so moved by the amount. I was very lucky. My route to homelessness wasn't through addiction or any kind of trauma or abuse. It was literally the breakdown of a relationship and then finding myself on my butt and nowhere to go. So I slept in my car for 5 months.
Yeah.
And then eventually your car insurance runs out, the car tax runs out, you can't keep it around. It's very scary sleeping in the city in a car anyway, because everybody wants to come and bang on your roof and rock the car and think it's funny to wake you up. So I went and slept in the car, drove out in the back of Epsom Racecourse in the forest out there.
Gosh.
And then that's equally as scary, because I'm sitting there in the middle of nowhere, in the dark, pouring with rain. I'm thinking, what if somebody comes, gets me, or does something to me? No one's going to find me.
Just sets fire to your car for fun.
Yeah, my kids will never know, and who knows how long it will take. So, you know, and I had a car, not a tent.
Yeah.
And I was still scared. And I was fortunate to go into a little hostel. There's only 20 users there, or service users there. I went there and I got moved on to the YMCA, then eventually on to my own private rented accommodation, because I'm a little bit driven like that. I wanted to get back into work and get myself together, so I really pushed hard. So within 18 months, 20 months, I was back on my feet. But not everyone has that, because of the various routes that lead them to homelessness in the first place. It's a mixture of things. It's no one thing, no one person's story.
But we can agree that it's a lifestyle choice, can we, Harry?
Yeah, right.
Why would she use those words? Why? Who does that tickle? Who does that appeal to? I mean, even the sort of columnists and commentators that I usually refer to, either directly or obliquely, even they surely aren't going to buy this, are they?
I don't know who's buying it, but I imagine it's for people like Suella. It helps them sleep better at night, because what they think is, if we take people's tents away, then they can actually go back to their other home that they got, that they're obviously not declaring, and, you know, living this life of Riley, sort of out begging on the streets.
The government say they're ensuring those who are vulnerable get vital support, and immediately Shelter and Crisis and pretty much anybody working in the sector comes out and says, well, no one's spoken to us about it.
Yeah, it's absolutely false flag, completely. I mean, all of the services, all the places where you signpost people, let's just take addiction, for example.
Yes.
The places you point them and signpost them to, they're closing down, and the strict criteria that people have to meet in order to get on a program and start working on themselves in the first place, it's incredibly
huge.
high.
I mean, it's another thing. Short term, it's expensive, but long term, the savings and indeed the revenues raised would dwarf the costs in the short term of actually addressing it. You've made me think of something quite unpleasant, Harry. I think she wants everyone to be sleeping in forests, because if you look at the syntax of what's come out of the Home Office, it seems to me that it's when tents become a nuisance. That's why this is a spokesman for the Home Office, so talking about tents becoming a nuisance begging and rough sleeping. So they're going to take away tents, and they're going to possibly prosecute charities or punish charities for providing tents that, and in the Telegraph's words, that become a nuisance. So if you're sleeping in the pitch black in a forest, terrified out of your wits, they can live with that. But if you're pitching up on a high street and reminding everybody walking past that this is what 13 years of Tory rule looked like, then you better jog on sharpish, pal.
You know why? There's two kinds of people, James. There's those that will stop and engage and talk with homeless people.
There's very few of them, and it's quite hard to do. I try, but I wouldn't put myself in that category. I think there's more than two. I'm sorry to interrupt you. There's a lot of people who feel enormous pain when they see homeless people, but don't necessarily do a lot about it. And then there's people who are like Suella Braverman as well.
I think there's a lot of people that can't do anything about it, and that's why they don't.
Sure.
So, I mean, that's forgivable. But the people I think Suella is aiming this at are the people who, as they're walking along the pavement, will, rather than engage or smile or even just, say good morning or whatever, just be pleasant about it, they will go out of their way to cross the road or walk in the road.
Or the ones that say get a job, the ones that have no real desire to understand the myriad, multifarious scenarios that can lead someone into temporarily, of course, in most cases and in your case. But why lifestyle choice? That's just so odd, isn't it? How bleak would your worldview have to be for you to see someone pretty much as low as you can go and think that they've somehow elected to be there over all the other preferable options available to them? It's almost beyond comprehension to me.
Incredulous.
Yeah, me too. Until you remember who it is, and then you remember that not for the first time we find ourselves wondering whether there is any depth to which this really quite repellent politician will not stoop. In pursuit of what, though, on this occasion? I just don't know if homeless people sleeping in tents have anything like as big a target painted upon their back for disgusting, divisive, provocative politicians. 10:46 is the time.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10 to 11. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we, with a sort of sense of grim wonderment, continue to contemplate Suella Braverman's conclusion that the best way to tackle the fact that far too many people in this country are sleeping in tents is to ban tents. Sarah's in High Wycombe. Sarah, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello,
I think I know the reason that Suella is up to this, and it's actually honestly making me feel slightly queasy because it's going to allow her to attack some of the absolutely most vulnerable people in the country. So recently there was a rule change in the Home Office, and the rule change is that people in asylum seeker accommodation, if they get their refugee status, they now have 1 week to leave their asylum seeker accommodation and find an independent accommodation somewhere. And charities are really struggling because we all know how difficult it is to get a flat in the UK. Yes. You can't get a flat in a week.
What was it previously? 28 days?
It was 28 days.
Which still isn't much, but it's
not enough. But it's
different.
Yeah, it's better than a week. So what is going to be happening in the next few months is there are going to be lots of, particularly Afghans, I think, people getting refugee status, probably camping out in tents. Right. And I think what Suella will do is bring these people into her big culture war, point to them and say, look at all these scary foreigners living on our streets. And then I expect they'll be going into the next election, the Conservatives, with their let's leave the European Convention on Human Rights because these people are a threat to us. So I think it's part this homelessness thing.
But these are
part of the culture war.
Yeah, it makes sense in that context. Actually, more sense than any other theory that's been put up so far. But and of course, it continues her very deliberate and determined conflation of bona fide refugees with asylum seekers who may well turn out to be bona fide refugees, and of course what the people that they prefer to call economic migrants, and to conflate them all as quotes illegals, end quotes. But what we're talking about here is people whose application has been found to be sound, and if you've come from Afghanistan, then that quite possibly involves involvement in or association with the British Army, British forces, or certainly enmity of the Taliban.
Yeah, and I think on the broader point, what the Conservatives are doing, I think, so I hands up, I'm a Labour activist, I door knock for Labour, and you door knock on somebody's door, and they spend 10 to 20 minutes telling you all the things that are wrong. So my child's school doesn't have teachers, my road is full of potholes, I can't get an appointment, 20 minutes, everything going wrong. and you then say, oh, are you thinking about voting Labour? And they say, oh, no, I haven't really thought about it. They're all the same. And I think it's because what's happening is that I think people have become so dissatisfied with with governments. They think that nobody is going to make their lives any better.
Yes.
And so then the Conservatives say, oh, but at least we're not going to make your life worse. At least we're not going to add something on the top, such as 7 bins or ULEZ or something like that.
Yeah.
So people have got no hope for a positive
We're
anymore.
going to stop the war on motorists. There is no war on motorists. Doesn't matter. We're going to stop the war on motorists. Here's the thing. Here's the thing someone's just pointed out to me, Sarah. In 2019, a previously unknown candidate for a Conservative parliamentary candidate who'd recently left the Labour Party under interesting circumstances, he announced that nuisance council tenants, should be forced to live in tents and pick vegetables. He's now deputy chairman of the Conservative Party. So the deputy chairman of the Conservative Party wants to force people to live in tents. And the Conservative Home Secretary simultaneously wants to ban tents being inhabited by homeless people. It's almost as if they haven't got a Scooby-Doo what they're doing, isn't it?
Can I give you a little bit of hope? I door-knocked somebody on Saturday morning. She was 87 years old, and she was a Daily Mail reader. And she said to me, I'm not even going to open my Daily Mail this morning because it's all lies. And she was thinking of switching over, 87 years old, having always voted Labour. And, Wickham, we haven't had a Labour MP for 71 years. We've got quite a good chance this time. So there is hope. We have got to cling to the hope.
Tricky on Saturdays, though, because the TV guide is so brilliant. I know lots of people who take the Mail on Saturdays because it has got an absolutely superb TV guide. Why someone else doesn't just come along and do a brilliant TV guide, I do not know. But I'm being a little glib, Sarah. That you are indeed right. That is hope. That is good news. 10:55 is the time. Chapter 3, of course, of... Chapter 2 of my new book looks at the role that Paul Dacre has played in bringing Britain down to the levels that the people whose doors Sarah knocks on are describing. This curious combination of circumstances that have turned us into a country where stuff like this can happen. That's probably the best way of describing my book. It explains how we have been turned into a country where stuff like this can happen almost every day. Home Secretary deciding after 13 years of Tory rule, the Tory Home Secretary decides that the best way to tackle the number of people sleeping in tents is to ban tents. Jed's in Huntingdon. Jed, what would you like to say?
Well, James, I'm a co-founder of a charity called the Three Pillars, Feeding the Homeless and Supporting the Community. We operate in Peterborough, Huntingdon, St Neots, Rushden and also in Northampton. We started 7 years ago. We provide food, hot food, tents, sleeping bags, toiletries, clothes, whatever we need on a regular basis from our vans that go out across this area.
Right.
What happens is that you've got a massive amount of people who are homeless through no fault of their own. It's not a lifestyle choice.
But it's Jed, it's so obviously not a lifestyle choice that there's a little bit of me that wants to know why she says it is. Who is she trying to seed that idea with?
Well, she's just dog whistling, James.
Yes.
It's just a typical... I think it's a perverse bid for the leadership, but that's another thing.
Sure.
One of the sad things is that they deferred Section 21. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's going to be a massive problem if they don't deal with that. We set out to just support people, right? But what we've found is that supporting and feeding, you don't solve the problem.
No, of course you don't.
So
it's like a holding tactic, isn't it, as it
were?
Yes.
We give them tents. The tents are then collected by the council because they're unsightly. Yeah, and they dump them. So we give new tents out.
So it already happens.
So they don't.
So what they want to do is they want to make it possibly a criminal offence, or they want to punish you. They want to punish the charity for providing tents.
Well, they'll have to take me to court, James. Yeah, I've just retired from the judicial system. Yeah,
right.
I know that every November that there will be regular clients appearing in the court, and I will send them to prison. Yeah, and it's a deliberate ploy. Yeah, they know that they cross the custody threshold.
Right.
They'll only serve half that sentence. But what they do is they'll kick off just the week before they're going to be released and lose their remission.
Because they'd rather stay inside.
Yeah, of course, because they've got meals, they've got warmth, they've got everything. It's criminal. And one of the most, we've had deaths on the street, yeah?
Yes, of course.
A lot of overdose. But one of the most poignant things which really got to me, about 6 years ago when we first started, we've been going just over a year, and there was a couple used to come, Lithuanian.
Yeah.
She was quite disabled. He was okay, but his English was very limited.
Right.
And she turns up one day, and I said to her, "Where's Tavis? He's dead." I said, "What do you mean he's dead?" And she couldn't really communicate, but there was a lovely Polish girl there who could speak Lithuanian,
right.
And she interpreted. What had happened is that they set their tents up outside some luxury flats on the river in Peterborough.
Yeah.
The residents complained. The police came and moved them on. What he would do on a Sunday morning, he'd get up and he'd go and have a wash in the river, yeah, and then he'd go back to his tent.
Right.
They moved him further up the river. He got up in the morning, a different part of the river, gone to get a wash, and fell in and drowned. Right? Oh. Now, at his funeral, there was me, Abby, who's one of our volunteers, his partner, and the Polish girl who'd done the interpretation. And she said to me, his family in Lithuania will never, ever know what happened to him. Yeah?
Yeah.
And that's criminal. Oh,
and that's a lifestyle choice, Jed.
It is. And I walk past the chap in Peterborough, and I always go over and talk to them. Yeah, I never give them money. I'll buy them coffee. I'll buy them meals or anything they want. And I went and got this chap a coffee. I didn't notice his sign at first. Yeah?
Yeah.
And when I went back with the food, I gave him the coffee. He wanted cakes, which right. I got him cakes and a sausage roll and stuff. And then I noticed its sign, and it just said, normally it will say, "I'm hungry, I'm homeless, can you help?" It just said, "Once I was like you." That chap was a chartered accountant. Marital breakdown, went off the rails, went on the drink, lost everything. We got him into the YMCA in Breton. They're fantastic. They've got a big complex there, 89 apartments. We pay the first month's rent, and we feed them for the first week until they get the benefits through. And then we got him in touch with Reed Employment, who are fantastic. They then got him a job as a bookkeeper over in Milton Keynes. 2 years ago, he phoned me and he said, "Jed, I just wanted to let you know I've just started my own practice back up as a chartered accountant." I said, "Mark, fantastic." So, instead of criticising people and taking the tents or fining charities or making it a criminal offence, they should actually deal with the problem that they keep saying they're going to do, but they've wrecked the council funding. Yeah, so the council have got no money.
The extraordinary thing about this, and I'd like to just, I know I sense you're probably not the kind of man that accepts these kind of compliments comfortably, but I'm very proud to have spoken to you. I'm proud that you're listening to this programme. And
James, I listen to you every day.
Good. So you should, Jed. But no, I'm talking about you now, not me. So thank you for being you, and thank you for doing what you do. But what I'm going to take away from this is the memory of the man that died, and the knowledge that the current policy, as it stands in what was announced on Twitter, which is almost contemptuous in itself, would actually criminalise you. So if we knit together the last hour of conversation that we've all had together, you, as a man who works for a charity that routinely gives tents to these people, you would be the one that Suella Braverman was coming after. It would be your charity. It would be Three Pillars in Peterborough that faced fines for providing tents to the people like, what was the name of the Lithuanian man, Jed?
Tavis.
To people like Tavis.
Yeah.
Please just carry on doing what you're doing until, please God, you don't have to anymore.
Irrespective of what this government do in the time they've got left, and I do pray and hope that they are destroyed in the next general election, because they don't deserve any opportunities to go forward. It just really frustrates me that you get comments like that.
Frustrate doesn't come close, does it?
It's just so annoying.
Jed, thank
and
you.
we've worked extremely hard, James, to support
clearly.
people.
And long may you do so. Long may you do so. And I've looked you up. I mean, the people can do the same. 3 Pillars Peterborough will lead you directly to the website of Jed's charity. So Suella Braverman listens to a story like that and she comes away convinced of 2 things. Number 1, that Tavis had made a lifestyle choice shortly before he drowned in a river while trying to wash himself. And number 2, what do you mean he had a bloody tent?
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
6 minutes after 11. A very good morning to you. It's funny, isn't it? This story has been creeping up on us for some time. In fact, we have touched on elements of it already. I was on stage in Northampton last night. I've had a wonderful time tootling up and down the country over the last week. We're at Birmingham on Saturday, thanks to everyone at the Glee Club, the Royal and Derngate Theatre in Northampton last night, all sell-out crowds. Had a wonderful time in Southampton, a beautiful space in Southampton, and indeed in Bath, another beautiful space. But last night I spoke to somebody who did actually ring in when we were discussing the difficulties of getting hold of hormone replacement therapy. And as a consequence of ringing into this programme, her story had quite a happy ending. But the story's getting bigger, not smaller. And it is... I nearly said I'm afraid then. I mean, why would James O'Brexit be afraid that a story is a direct consequence of Brexit? I suppose, the problem with being a liberal, or whatever word you want to use to describe somebody who doesn't blame all of the ills upon the world and on people less vulnerable than himself, one of the problems is that you kind of have a capacity to feel sorry for almost everybody, even people who are in many ways possessed of views that are the polar opposite of yours. You feel sorry for the way that they've been manipulated. But I almost think now that if you voted for Brexit, it's probably just becoming a bit unkind to keep pointing out to you what a stupid thing that was to do, what a ridiculous thing that was. There's so much evidence in your own life about how absurd it is and how misled you were, and I always crucially point to the fact that you were misled. Even if you were a massive racist and you thought that you were going to reduce the number of people coming here for overseas, that's backfired horribly. And from a racist point of view, it's presumably even worse that the people coming here now are people possessed of different skin colours to you. Because if you thought Polish people were bad, then I presume that you find people from South Asia even more unwelcomable. So there's a tiny bit of me that I've noticed kicking in recent weeks, only recent weeks, that thinks that you deserve a bit of a break. It's almost as if I think you deserve some charity. God, I said, do we really have to? And I don't do much. We generally don't turn to it. I might mention it in the context of conversations about things that are going in a suboptimal direction and point out that although things might still be suboptimal, they'd be a heck of a lot better than they are now if we hadn't voted to become the first country in history to impose economic sanctions on itself. But there are some days where you can't I can't give you a break. I can't look the other way. I can't allow my sympathy for the position in which you've put yourself and the rest of the country to prevent me from covering the actual news. And we are now at the point where severe delays in drugs supplies caused by Brexit red tape are, well, in the words of experts, are presenting a very worrying risk. We're looking at vital antibiotics, hormone replacement therapy, ADHD drugs, that's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, are now in desperately short supply this winter. And it means the NHS is now paying over the odds to get the drugs into Britain. So once again, it is costing more to do what we did before as a consequence of a decision that you were promised would save us money. There'd be £350 million a week for the NHS. Remember? You remember that? And yet we're now paying more for stuff than we would have done if we hadn't voted to leave the European Union. Professor Martin McKee, is at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. He says the health of patients who rely on day-to-day medications is being put at risk because of very worrying recurring shortages. Stockpiles are essentially running out, and the use-by dates, the sell-by date, whatever you call them, they go out of date. So the further we get away from the imposition of unnecessary red tape, brand spanking new red tape, Jacob Rees-Mogg flavoured, box fresh red tape. The people that told you they wanted to get rid of red tape, by which they meant things like protections in the workplace, minimum wage legislation, health and safety requirements for workplaces. That's all the red tape they want to get rid of. Rules governing things like, cladding on the side of buildings. All those pesky regulations and red tapes that people like Jacob Rees-Mogg want to get rid of. They told you all about that without A, mentioning what they actually want, what they really wanted to get rid of, and B, mentioning that it would actually involve the imposition of reams and ribbons of new levels of red tape. And I can have a crack at explaining it to you, but I think I might let somebody rather better qualified than me explain the extra problems in managing medicines, the fact that you can't stockpile stuff, it goes out of date, you can't match supply, problems in supply chains and non-tariff barriers because of Brexit. And then you've got the added the compounding problem of anxiety. I hear this a bit from pet owners as well. In fact, we've encountered it ourselves in the context of medication for one of our cats. But that is the bottom line. It is a Brexit-related problem. So how do we do it? I mean, most obviously, if you are affected by this, I want to know what it is like to be affected by this. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. I mean, there are 102 medicines now that have been listed as being in shortage. The previous high in February of last year was less than half of that. So the problem is, even those of us who have been crystal clear from the outset about what an act of unimaginable madness it was to remove ourselves from the largest trading bloc on the planet and abolish our own freedom of movement while being told by people like Priti Patel to celebrate, only country in history that's imposed economic sanctions on itself and been told by its government to celebrate the removal of freedoms. Actually, the second bit's probably not true. Soviet-era Russia was probably told. Stalin was probably telling people, wasn't he, to celebrate their removal of freedoms because it was, I don't know, a mark of the bourgeoisie or something like that. But we've got more medicine products now in shortage than ever before, more than twice as many in shortage than ever before. So it's not one of those things that we can console ourselves with the thought that, oh, well, the system will adjust, the system will recalibrate, the system will adapt. That's the word I want. The system will adapt. And business people, in this case, pharmaceutical importers, they will overcome the obstacles because they have to. That's how business works. It's like water trickling downhill. It doesn't matter what obstacles it encounters, it will have to continue trickling downhill. I'm not so sure anymore. You know, some of these problems many of these problems are getting bigger. It's a report from the Independent Commission on UK-EU relations, which points to costly new paperwork and new regulatory barriers as major factors. So people with an investment in the story are front of the queue on this one, and that includes people who are in the business of dishing out medicines, so doctors, nurses, and probably most obviously pharmacists. How bad is it, and what is your understanding of why these problems are increasing, not decreasing, as we move further into the post-Brexit period? 0345 6060 973. If you're in the business of import and export, if you have to negotiate this red tape, straight to the front of the queue with you as well. 0345 6060 973. If you are in need of daily medication, if you are living a life where previously it was never even a fear, it was not on your list of things to worry about, that you might turn up at Boots and be told, sorry, we haven't got any in. We haven't got any in stock. That just didn't happen before. And now it happens quite regularly. What stresses are you exposed to? What are the medical ramifications of these problems in your life? What anxieties are you enduring? And what lengths are you going to now to get hold of the medication that you need? 0345 6060 973. Those are the three, I think, most obvious entry points on this conversation for a programme that does its best most days to deal more in evidence than anecdote. I think this is one of those lovely opportunities to recognise that the two are often very, very set. If it's happening to you, it's evidence of the bigger problem, but it is also an anecdote. So pharmacists, doctors, nurses, patients, who else? Importers, exporters, trade experts. I mean, why is it happening? What are the requirements now that are in place that weren't in place before? And what is happening in the context of your professional or personal experience? Because I'll tell you something for nothing. People who told you that everything was going to be hunky-dory, the people who told you that everything was going to get better, the people who told you that the NHS was going to be more lavishly funded than ever before, the people who told you that we would be getting rid of red tape and therefore making trade easier, they won't take responsibility for this. They won't acknowledge this. They won't talk about this. If they talk about it, it will be to deny it, to deny observable reality. They won't do it. So the least we can do for each other is work out what the facts are. The number you need is 0345 6060 973. It's 11:17.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
20 minutes after 11 is the time, and your timely reminder that whenever experts tell us that Brexit is responsible in part for problems that we are facing, the fact that comparable but smaller problems elsewhere in the world exist does not prove that the experts are wrong and that it has nothing to do with Brexit. Okay? Imagine that you were driving a car that had and a wheel fell off. Okay? And you closed your eyes. The fact that people driving cars with their eyes open also have problems when a wheel falls off does not prove that having your eyes shut is not the best way to approach the challenge of driving a car when the wheel falls off. 21 minutes after 11, which actually, now I come to mention it, is something else that Nigel Farage lied about, wasn't it, in the past? Medication. Lewis in Putney is here. Lewis is a regular caller to the programme, normally confines his contributions to Mystery Hour, but I can tell you that he actually works smack in the middle of pharmaceutical transportation, importing and exporting. So you've been waiting years for this moment, Lewis.
Yeah, pretty much. This is it. This is
my
it. Hour.
Yes, this is it. The planets have aligned. Cometh the hour, cometh the Lewis. What would you like to say?
So I can tell you why we're having all these shortages, if you like. Please. Or I can give the best explanation. I think my analogy would be, as you were saying about the car, I'd say it's like cycling on a bike with deflated wheels, except with Britain, one of the brakes is also rubbing.
Yeah.
Is how I'd say it.
So there's a global problem of shortage, but we've made our situation even worse by introducing the new regulations and tests.
Yeah. So basically, what we're discussing here is mutual recognition agreements, or MRAs, and Europe has a giant MRA that covers all European countries. That means that any drug tested or developed in Europe meets European standards. And when that test happens, or that what we call a C of A, certificate of analysis, that happens in France or Croatia or Poland, it's valid in every one of the countries because it's all to the same standards. Yes. We audit each other to make sure that we do that. Britain has now opted out. We are a third country.
When did we do that?
Don't have that MRA. Sorry?
When did we do that? Was that the day that it kicked in a couple of years ago, on that sort of January?
Yeah. Well, actually, I started my job in October 2019.
Right.
Because for this reason, for Brexit, to get us ready for Brexit. And luckily it got delayed till like December or something.
And what was it? Just another sort of accidental, caught up and not really knowing what they were doing kind of scenario. We've got to get rid of this. We've got to get out of that. So, when Rees-Mogg talks about we need to abolish all legislation that was passed as members of the European Union, he just doesn't understand anything. He doesn't understand that it involves pulling out of things like, could we have stayed in? Could we have stayed in if we wanted to, for example, on the MRAs?
Yeah, we could have.
Under what possible
ration? The customs agreement would have had to, have to be in the customs there because it's free transport. It's the thing. Because what I was going to add is pharmaceuticals is the second most regulated industry in the world, behind nuclear, which makes sense.
Yeah, fair enough.
But the whole point of it is trust. Like you trust when we make a vaccine, a pill, or whatever, that when you take that, it does what it says because you trust the doctor prescribing it, and you trust that every stage from manufacture to transport to you taking it has been maintained. And this is what we call the chain of custody. It's why you can't have drugs back.
Yes.
Like, when people say they've been overprescribed, we don't know what's happened.
Got it.
Because with a lot of drugs, a lot of them are very temperature sensitive.
Yes.
And you have to maintain them in certain ranges, which is also why you can't store them in certain warehouses. And also other drugs, like controlled drugs, that you can get, like opioids or something, need to have certain levels of security. You can't keep them in your average warehouse for several weeks at customs waiting for it to be cleared if there's problems with the paperwork. They're just too sensitive, especially the life-saving ones.
So we can't bring in stuff from we could call it a customs union or a community of mutual trust because we're not in it anymore.
Correct. Although
Go on.
There are certain agreements to make sure and we can sort of rush through certain ones with special exemptions from the MHRA.
Special exemptions.
But that's a bit like how the food.
And the people, and the workers, special exemptions for workers. Oh, I see what you mean. So you run the risk then of bringing in food that actually isn't safe because you're so desperate to bring something in that you'll bring it in without the checks that are in place for other populations.
Yeah. But imagine that with medicine, and we don't want that.
No, we don't want that. What's the broader shortage? Like this is a problem that is affecting other countries, but it's affecting us even more. So why are the tyres flat? Why is there a shortage? Why are there shortages in so many areas that weren't there before?
So a large part of it's still a hangover from COVID because of lots of drug stockpiling. And as I was saying, you need certain warehouses to do this. And lots of countries have stockpiled lots of different drugs during the crisis, not knowing when it was going to end. And that takes up a lot of capacity.
Yeah.
Combined with that, large drug manufacturers like the ones I work for, we are constantly trying to predict what we need in the future.
Yes.
And if we get that wrong, we'll have a load of excess stock, and resetting manufacturing lines, even for large companies, takes a long time, and you've got to revalidate that. And then potentially you've got to get that drug tested. And like I said, a C of A from Europe doesn't technically wash in the UK anymore. And we've only got so many labs that can test in this country to do that.
So where something that was previously tested in Bonn or Berlin would come here unmolested and be in pharmacies overnight, now it has to be tested independently on British soil before it can make its way from warehouse to pharmacy.
Unless we get exemptions, which we largely are. But like you said, it's still, we need to get that memo.
And who issues the exemptions?
Sorry?
Who issues the exemptions? The Department of Health?
Yeah, like the MHRA.
So they will be saying, don't worry about testing this stuff. And that's why you mentioned food, because you could have
the test from Europe. They'll say the test from Europe is still valid in this country.
Okay, and it usually will be, but if we're not checking that, then you run the risk of the pharmaceutical equivalent of that meat that came in from Romania that was unfit for human consumption.
Not quite. It will always be checked.
Right.
It's just saying that the European one is acceptable in the UK.
But that means that we're abiding by their rules, Lewis.
We are. But we make the rules. The MHRA are they do
world
they used to do about 40%. We were the rule makers.
And now we're the rule takers.
Technically, yes.
Well, is there light at the end of the tunnel? I mean, the industry will recalibrate, won't it, on the supply issue, the supply chain issue, and the stockpile winding down, and things will get better. But will we always be worse off than other European Union countries as a consequence of what you've just described?
Depends who's in government, is what I would say to that. Like you said about water coming down.
Yes.
It will always. The market will always eventually adapt.
Of course it will. Yes.
But
the amount of obstacles the water has to trickle around will depend on whether or not governments are whether they sort of publicly announce it or not, whether they are prepared to essentially return to regulatory alignment.
Yes, and the further we potentially drift from pharmaceutical regulatory alignment, the more testing you have to do. Or no, you have to test them.
The more of your own testing that you have to do. And remember, regulatory alignment remains something that the usual suspects insist that we must not do and must not contemplate. But of course, if you were to ask them to perhaps debate with Lewis on the wisdom of their position, they would fall apart like the cheapest of suits. Lewis, you lived up to the very, very heady billing that I gave you, as I was certain, supremely confident you would. 11:30. So know, there is the pharmaceutical industry's insight. There is the reason why what is happening is happening. We move next to perhaps the pharmacies, who I think are having to be quite creative in their prescriptions. Individual pharmacies will be dealing with issues by putting together prescriptions that are different from that which the patient is used to, in the hope that it will have the same effect or that it will achieve the same ends. And then you've got the patient, the stress of trying to find the stuff that didn't used to be hard to find. And I will again, because I do think it's important to treat you with a modicum of respect. If you're casting around desperately trying to find evidence that there are problems in France and problems in Germany, and that proves that it's nothing to do with Brexit, the first bit is right. There are problems in France and Germany as well. But we've added to those problems, to those shared problems, by doing all of the things that Lewis has just described, by making it harder, for example, for a British pharmacist to issue medicine that has been tested in Germany than it would be for a French pharmacist. We've just made it harder. And if you've got a stockpile of medicine, where are you going to send it? The place where it can be in pharmacies really, really quickly and the deal will be done? Or are you going to send it to the place where there'll be lots of tests? And that's a rhetorical question. So in order for the place where there'll be lots more tests to get it, for the supply chain to be still slower, they'll end up paying even more. That's not an opinion. That's counting. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
26 minutes after 12. I suppose Suella Braverman could suggest that we respond to these severe drug shortages caused by Brexit red tape by banning illnesses. That might be quite a good approach to the problem, similar to the one she seems to be poised to take towards homelessness. And a couple of you have pointed out that another solution to this might be the one that Boris Johnson wanted to adopt with regard to the COVID-19 pandemic. Mikey puts it best. It would just let nature take its course. Just let nature take its course. In fact, medicines are so woke, aren't they? Don't you think medicines are woke? Back in the day, do you think Neanderthals had medicines? Do you think they had medicines at the Battle of Agincourt? I mean, really, it's such a snowflake generation with all these medicines. It's absolutely ridiculous. I am, of course, being incredibly tongue-in-cheek because some of the stories coming in now are pretty grim, but also a little repetitive. I mean, if you're living this, then you're not going to be shocked by what the rest of us are today, somewhat shocked by. It is 25 to 12. And remember, this is just the medical equivalent of all the other stuff that's going on in the realms of import and export. I don't know if you remember Craig ringing in a while ago who was driving to Spain with a delivery of seeds. He's got a mate with a trucking company who accidentally put the paperwork for a lorry load of cheese with a lorry load of wine. I sound like Cilla Black. A lorry load of wine. A lorry load. So he put the paperwork for a lorry load of cheese with the lorry load of wine and a paperwork for a lorry load of wine with a lorry load of cheese. And 1 year later, the wine is still there. Took nearly 3 months to get the truck and trailer back, but the wine is still there. So that is what we've done. That is what we've done. Elizabeth is in Belfast. Elizabeth, what would you like to say?
Just in relation to the difficulty obtaining drugs, I have one child and one young adult who are on controlled attention deficit disorder medication, which comes under the umbrella of ADHD.
Yes.
And whilst it's been difficult to get for the last year, the last 2 to 3 months, it's becoming near on impossible to obtain.
Yes.
And the difficulty with that is, firstly, it's a controlled medication. You can't stockpile it. You can only get a prescription once a month.
Right.
So because you can only get a prescription once a month, that's 30 days where you're running out of medication very quickly.
Yes.
So I most recently picked up medication for my 12-year-old. I had to ring around 27 pharmacies, of which none of them had the medication in.
27?
27. Yeah.
Holy moly.
I had to go back to the GP practice on 3 different occasions because my 12-year-old is on 50 milligrams of a certain medication.
Yes.
You can't change it because controlled medications has major side effects, and the drug my daughter is now on does have side effects, but probably the least amount of side effects compared to other drugs.
This is I'm just going to pause you if I may, because this is such an important point that people who are not where you are may not understand. Even brand to brand of what are supposedly the same generic medicine, the same people will experience different reactions, and you I forget what the correct word is, but you work out what's best for you, don't you? So it's not just about getting the treatment, it's about getting the best available version of that treatment for each individual and specific patient. And if you're lucky enough to have doctors, good doctors, then they'll work on that with you. And now you're finding you can't get the ones that you want.
No, we can't. And as I said, I have two children, both who have ADD and are on the same medication, but actually both have very different side effects to the medication. So even per child, it's very, very different.
Yes.
But the difficulty is you can't just stop these medications. They are controlled medications. They do a very specific job. And to not have them has a massive impact, not only on the side effects, because once it starts to wear off the body, they then have to go back on it. It takes at least 3 months for it to go back into the system. They suffer really severe headaches, awful cramps in their stomachs. They feel generally very unwell. And it isn't as simple as just starting it. The other issue is the GP can't just change medication. No. You have to go back to the consultant psychiatrist in order to change the medication.
Yeah,
that's on the NHS. You can't get an appointment to see the consultant. So there are so many implications. And these are children who are neurodiverse, who have very specific needs in order to be able to attend school. My eldest daughter's in university, and she's in the UK studying at uni and is really struggling to get the medication. And she's a young adult and finds it hard to ring up a GP practice and put them under pressure, whereas as a parent, it's much easier to do, but as a young adult, it's difficult.
It will exacerbate other things, will it, as well? Whether maybe not for your daughter, but for other people, it will exacerbate anxieties and things like that.
Both my children, as having ADD, they do have a really strong level of anxiety.
I thought they would.
It really, really does affect them. And it's not as simple as just saying, we can change the medication. They're controlled medications. They have a very specific role.
What are you being told?
It's so frustrating.
Yes, you sound very calm, but I suspect that's because you've got used to it. It's a calmness born of resignation, whereas many people listening to this will be in the early stages of surprise, even if they're not directly affected by it. So when you ring around 27 pharmacies, I'm sure you don't pause to ask each of them what it is that's happened to exacerbate this situation. But what is the consensus? What is the reason that you're being given?
I would say 90% say it's to do with Brexit. Some will say it's a worldwide shortage at a manufacturer level. Some say it's to do with the stockists of the people who it's supplied into in the UK.
Yes.
There's varying different, but I have to say the pharmacists do their absolute best. They're
Always
struggling
they do.
With
and there's a shortage of pharmacists as well, I think, at the moment in the country.
Yeah. And we're very lucky in the practice that I'm in. We have a superb practice pharmacist who you go to and just say, like, for example, as I've explained, they're on 50 milligrams. So you try and maybe, can you get a tablet that's 30 and can you also get a 20 milligram tablet?
Yeah.
So then taking 2 tablets. Or you try and get it in an oral solution if possible, but then you're having to take 8 to 10 oral, spoons of medication. So it's just really, really, really difficult. There's also a difference, although the medication is the same, there's also a difference in terms of side effects between the adult medication and the children's medication. So a 12-year-old, I actually had to get the adult medication recently because I could not get it in the children's version. So it's the same medication, it's just branded slightly differently, and the side effects info is different. But I had to go back to the GP practice 3 times to get them to reissue different medications, and I had to ring the consultant to say, is it okay to give the 12-year-old the adult medication?
Final question, and I think everyone will understand why I want to ask it. If this was your job, how many hours a day would you be doing?
I work full time, and.
But how many hours are you doing? How much of your life is taken up trying to sort out your children's medication?
A good day.
A day a week.
Day. Yeah.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
So, in order to get the medication now, which with 1 week left before I have to start the whole process again, because you can only get it monthly.
Yes.
I have to ring round the pharmacist to see what is in place, to then go to the GP practice to ask them whether it's a 50 milligram adult, a 50 milligram child, or whether it's a variation of different milligrams to make up 50.
Well, good luck. And I'm sorry I had to ask that question at the end, but my goodness me, that says it all, doesn't it? The introduction of red tape on a scale that sees a mother of 2 reduced to doing essentially one full day's work a week in order to pursue what was once really, really easy to get. And listen, without Brexit, maybe she'd still be doing a couple of hours a day, a couple of hours a week, but it wouldn't be as much as it is now. I think we'll have a little visit to Idiot's Corner because there is... I mean it when I say I do sometimes feel for you if you thought this was going to be good, if you voted for this, because the evidence of how completely conned you were is becoming utterly irresistible unless you've got gammon for brains, which I appreciate. You know, there's a good 10 to 15% of the electorate who do have processed pork product between their ears. But it's genuine. And these are stories from mums and people who work in the industry and patients. So Chris can go in Idiot's Corner because he voted for it and he can't quite get to the place where he realises that what he's hearing about here today is his fault. So Chris writes, James O negative. That's funny. That's very clever because my name's O'Brien. So you say O negative. Scaring the 1.3 million once again. Mate, I'm talking about a professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I'm talking about the commissioner of the Nuffield Trust. I'm talking about the chief executive of Community Pharmacy England. I'm talking about Professor Camilla Hawthorne, the chair of the Royal College of GPs. Chris, I'm talking about the president of the Royal Pharmaceutical Society. I'm talking about all of these people describing severe drug shortages due to Brexit red tape. So, I mean, it's really hilarious when you call me James O negative, but would you call Professor Martin McKee of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine Professor negative? Would you call Mike Buckley, the commissioner of the Nuffield Trust, which contributed to the report, let's call him Mike negative? Yeah, funny. And that makes the problem go away. Janet Morrison, the chief executive of Community Pharmacy England. I'll tell you what, Chris, let's call her Janet negative, yeah? Yeah, that's a good one, yeah. Janet negative. And then all the people who are absolutely terrified about what's going to happen if they can't get their daily medication, they can all just relax. So we'll call her Janet negative. Stephen Dorrell, he was a Conservative health secretary in John Major's government. He says, it's amazing to think Brexiteers thought it was a good idea to disrupt the supply chain and didn't think medicine would be included. That's you, Chris. He's talking about you. It was an amazing that you thought this would be a good idea. But let's just call him Stephen Negative. And then we don't have to worry about all the people who are panicking about what's going to happen if they don't get their medicines. Here's another one, mate. Professor Camilla Hawthorne. Hey, Professor Camilla Negative. Am I right? Professor Camilla Negative? Yeah, she's just the chair of the Royal College of GPs. What does she know? Professor Claire Anderson. Professor Claire Negative, the president of the Royal Pharmaceutical Society, Chris. What does she know, eh? Oh, just scaring people unnecessarily. I'm not sure Idiot's Corner is big enough for a bozo like you, pal.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 11:49 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Very briefly, do you remember when I told you that ULEZ was the biggest load of hot air, if you pardon the pun, since the last massive load of hot air, and that it would disappear almost as soon as it was introduced, based upon what happened the time before. But people, some of whom have got a problem with Sadiq Khan's ethnicity, some of whom have got a problem with Sadiq Khan's religion, some of whom have got a problem with Sadiq Khan's politics, were determined to turn it into some sort of epic political problem that was going to scupper him. We reported last week how conversation about ULEZ on social media had gone down by, I think, 97%, and polling for the Evening Standard today, which has been far from friendly towards Sadiq Khan in the past, shows that he now enjoys a 25-point lead over the Conservative candidate, who had a crack, I think, at conference at trying to sort of portray him as anti-Semitic. He now enjoys a 25-point lead over a candidate called Susan Hall. So you'll remember people telling you, possibly even in this studio, people telling you daily almost about how absolutely awful ULEZ was and how it was this, that and the other. Turns out, as we did explain, occasionally, not that often because I find the subject quite dull, but it turns out that, as we did explain, it was nothing like the issue or the problem that same people who told you to vote for Brexit, actually, usually, But there you go. If you're still trusting them, I'm afraid that's a you problem, not a me problem. Now, on the long list of things that I completely ignore when they come into the studio, often features the, why aren't you talking about this? Because I do 3 hours a day, 15 hours a week, apart from Mystery Hour. And if I'm not talking about the thing you think I should be talking about now, it doesn't mean I'm not going to be talking about it in one of the other 14 hours that pass. So I normally ignore it. And then there are some things that I don't talk about much, sometimes for legal reasons, sometimes as with motoring issues because I find it very boring, and so I ignore them as well. But there are a couple that kind of get under the wire, and I think, yeah, I probably should be talking about that. But I have to be careful what I say. And one of the things you're constantly saying to me is, what's going on with Michelle Mone? What is happening with regard to those allegations of involvement in a VIP lane PPE company? Well, the investigations correspondent for The Guardian, David Conn, has been on this story for I think the best part of 3 years, and he has published something of an update this morning. David joins me now. I'll just, if I may, David, pick up on some of your previous reports. I know that in November 2020, Mone's lawyer told you that, and I quote, Baroness Mone is not connected in any way with PPE MedPro, and the lawyers for her husband repeatedly denied that he was an investor in the company or part of a consortium supporting it. And indeed, they told you, and once again I quote, that he never had any role or function in PPE MedPro. This is Douglas Barrowman. And that, of course, that insistence, that emphatic denial is absolutely intrinsic to the unfolding story. So what's the latest?
Yeah, so, and those denials that you've just read out, James, are just two of an absolute stream that we had from starting to write about this in late 2020 when the contracts were published, right through to last year when we revealed the leaked bank documents that indicated that Doug Barrowman, Michelle Mone's husband, had been paid £65 million from the profits of PPE MedPro and had transferred £29 million into a trust that had been set up for Michelle Mone and her 3 adult children. Right through that reporting, they've had 3 different firms of lawyers over time representing the company, Michelle Mone and Doug Barrowman at different times. And we've had a stream of constant and repeated and emphatic denials that they weren't involved, and these other words, not connected, the other ways in which we've quoted them. And then in this round, I've just gone back to them recently with some questions, and now a spokesperson for the company who said he was also authorised to speak on their behalf has said that they both were involved in PPE MedPro 3 years on from the start of all the denials. And he also said, which is really, I think, significant, but he said that the government was fully aware of I'm reading it now. Yeah. The government was fully aware of Baroness Mone's involvement, like many other peers and MPs on the high priority lane, which is the technical term for the VIP lane, where they fast-tracked offers of PPE from people who had political connections with the government or the Conservative Party. They say, like many other peers and MPs on the high priority lane, she, Baroness Mone, acted as an intermediary/liaison between PPE MedPro and the Cabinet Office, DHSC. And as you've just read out, James, amongst the denials are not connected in any way with PPE MedPro, never had any role or function, nor in the process by which contracts were awarded to PPE MedPro. But a very, very interesting detail, which I know you'll see the significance of straight away, is what they're saying is that the government was fully aware of her involvement, was fully aware of Doug Barrowman's role, and that his group would make a commercial profit. That's from their own spokesperson, right? And they say that they're saying that they, Doug Barrowman and Baroness Mone, made a full written disclosure of their involvement to the Cabinet Office prior to the award of the PPE contract. And that was in May 2020. So they made a full disclosure to the government that they were involved. And yet in public, in response to the media, in response to me, in response to other people that, point like the Good Law Project, yes, pointed to the links right at the beginning. Jolyon Maugham just pointed out the apparent links between this company and Baroness Mone. And in response to all of us publicly, there were these complete denials of involvement. But what they're saying is, at the same time as that, they'd made a full disclosure to the government, and the government was fully aware that they were involved.
It's extraordinary. I mean, as I read it, as I see it, it's impossible for them to have been telling the truth on both occasions, on the time when they said there wasn't any links at all, and now that they're saying there are links at all. I think up to and including Douglas Barrowman chairing the sort of process of deciding how they would and go forward with the attempt to secure these contracts. So they can't be simultaneously true, can it, that they weren't involved and were involved? But the easiest thing to check here would be the submission of this statement. So the government would have been aware of the involvement while Barrowman and Mone were issuing endless denials of involvement.
That's the logic of what they're saying, right? And so just one element of that has leapt out to me is that the government they cannot have been unaware of Baroness Mone and Doug Barrowman repeatedly denying involvement. Because, it's been the biggest story of the VIP lane. It's been very high profile. There is no way that government departments are not reading that they're denying involvement. And yet the whole way, and that we're dealing with that, the media is dealing with those denials. And yet the whole way through what they're saying is, but the government was sitting there knowing that they were involved.
You keep saying the media. I think you're being a bit modest. It's basically you and Jolyon over at the Good Law Project, because, of course, most of the newspapers you might expect to be pursuing this alongside you will have been announcing throughout this period that there was nothing to see here, and or that Boris Johnson was getting all the big calls right. But where does it go next, David? Do we know?
Yeah, just to be fair on that, James, thanks very much. But, the Financial Times has done quite a lot of work on it. The Mirror originally did, and also the Times has also done quite a lot of work on it. And people are very concerned about it. And obviously, the procurement of PPE, the awarding of contracts during the pandemic. I mean, when Jolyon Maugham first revealed the existence of a VIP lane for politically connected people. So what happened was, when COVID hit, it's true that not just our government, but governments all around the world were overwhelmed with offers from people who said they could source PPE, because obviously we had next to no stockpile of PPE, didn't we? And it was running out almost immediately. And they did desperately have to go and source some, right? So they did need a way to prioritise credible offers. And this is going to be heard in the COVID inquiry. They're going to have a session on the procurement. But instead of prioritising companies whose business was supplying PPE, as you know, very many of those companies have said publicly they didn't get a look in.
They couldn't get their calls returned. They couldn't get through. We had people supplying incubators. What are they called? The big machines that you get hooked up
to.
Ventilators. We had people who had ventilators going begging who couldn't get their calls returned.
Yeah, they didn't get their calls returned. Nobody went to the industry. The government didn't just go to the industry and say, can you get us the best companies to source the PPE from the best suppliers, right? And so when Jolyon first revealed that, no, the people they prioritised and fast-tracked were people who had a connection to the government or a connection to, basically to the government, right? And that was considered credible. Well, we know them. that's come from one of our MPs, or that's come from one of our peers, from a member of the House of, Conservative member of the House of Lords. I thought that cannot be right. I remember when he first, I thought that can't be right. They wouldn't do that.
Even a cynical old soul like you, David Conn.
And here we are. 3 years later, they are admitting involvement after essentially denying it through 3 different firms of lawyers.
Incredible.
Coupled with, the way that lawyers write these things to us consistently throughout. And if it hadn't been, if it's not for people who come forward, who are, who do speak out and who do expose these things over time, I don't think any of this would be known. Whereas at the same time, they're saying that the government knew this all along while the denials were being made in public.
Yeah, murkier and murkier. I mean, do you think we'll get to the absolute bottom of it? Do you think the inquiry will bring the light in?
Well, the inquiry is doing a very good job,
So
isn't
far
it?
it is,
The
yes.
inquiry is looking like it's really proper. I know that some of the bereaved families have got some concerns about the limited role that they're getting, the limited prominence that they're getting. Their lawyers are only allowed to ask, I think it's 2 questions at the end of a session. But having said that, the fact that they've secured so much documentation and, there does seem to be a lot of rigour about it, makes it very interesting that when the whole inquiry into the handling of the pandemic, it makes it promising that maybe we will get to the truth and we will learn some lessons. On the procurement part of it, I think what's key is whether it's going to be a general, we really struggle to get decent PPE, or whether they're really going to get down to the details of individual contracts. Yeah.
I'm very late for the news, which is
I thought I was keeping you over the news,
No,
James.
don't worry about that. This is news,
that.
David. This is news, isn't it, David? There you go. That will be my excuse when I get told off later. But just to clarify finally, the Department of Health and Social Care is still suing PPE MedPro, is it, for the full return of £122 million it believed it paid for substandard surgical gowns?
It paid £122 million for gowns, and they rejected all of them on inspection, and they're suing PPE MedPro for the full return of the money plus other costs. And PPE MedPro are saying that the gowns were fit for purpose, and they're defending the claim.
David Conn of The Guardian, who has chapter and verse on this latest development in the saga of Michelle Mone and the VIP Lane PPE company in today's paper, or indeed on the website. And with the excuse that is actually news, I apologise for being so late for this news.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 7 minutes after 12, and we turn our attention next to a tricky tale that will involve sensitivity and will involve a lot of sensitivities, some of them possibly conflicting. I was very struck last week by the utter absurdity of a story about Keir Starmer and the poppy. I say this every year. It seems to come around every year, these desperate attempts to use the poppy, which is, of course, a commemoration of sacrifice in pursuit of freedom. People desperate to use the poppy to attack the exercise of freedom. So, you attack people for not wearing a symbol of freedom, which is quite a totalitarian and oppressive thing to do, actually. But whether it's an Irish football player or a newsreader, or on this occasion, there were a couple of newspapers last week, and so much time has passed since, you may struggle to believe this. A couple of newspapers last week pretended to believe that Keir Starmer had deliberately taken his poppy off before recording a commentary on Islamophobia. And nobody mentioned that at the same time, in the same newspapers, on the same day, in the same news cycle, Rishi Sunak was sitting on a stage with Elon Musk, who is in the business of restoring far-right provocateurs to his platform. I mean, actual Nazi sympathisers in some cases. He is in the business of platforming them, and Rishi Sunak managed to interview, I don't know what the correct word would be, I probably shouldn't use that word in the context that I'm about to on the radio, so I won't. But anyway, Rishi Sunak was on the stage with Elon Musk not wearing a poppy. All the people pretending to have a fit of the vapours about Keir Starmer wearing a poppy and then not wearing a poppy and then wearing one again had absolutely nothing whatsoever to say about Rishi Sunak sitting in front of the entire world on Elon Musk's lap and saying not wearing a poppy at all. So we live in strange times. Times that, if you were to adopt that attitude, would completely overlook the sacrifice made by hundreds of thousands of Muslim soldiers in the British Indian Army during the Second World War. And I didn't quite get it. I didn't quite get the story, except for this new theory I've come up with, target first, policy second. And that can be used by media as much as it can be used by political parties. Here's an opportunity to sow some division, to indulge in a little bit of low-level Islamophobia, you know, to kind of take that rump of support for right-wing parties and try and inflame it still further or big it up even more. And you've seen a lot of that with the tragic situation unfolding in Israel and Gaza. People almost struggling to disguise their glee at the massacre of Palestinians, while those of us who refuse to feel sorrier for a dead Palestinian baby than we do for a dead Israeli baby are also sometimes accused of indulging in controversial conduct, although I think we're all capable of staying strong. Tragedy is tragedy. Fanboying, I wouldn't say fangirling because I think that's mildly misogynistic, but it's what you're all going for. He was giggling like a schoolgirl, he was fangirling Elon Musk, but no, we'll just go with sitting on his lap. It's a metaphor. So I watched that poppy story unfold, and I've seen the pro-Palestinian protests, these expressions of solidarity with a civilian population that is being bombarded on an apocalyptic scale. Some people believe necessarily, some people believe unnecessarily. And we've seen these protests, these marches, which may have been infiltrated, have been infiltrated as far as we're aware, by a tiny, tiny number of people expressing support for terrorist acts, the terrorist acts of Hamas, deploying sometimes the phrase from the river to the sea, which many, many, many Jewish people and Israeli people feel is a call for the eradication of the modern state of Israel. So simply on the grounds of decency, even if that's not what you mean by the phrase, you probably shouldn't be using it if so many people are going to hear that threat to their very existence, or at least their very right to land. If you're going to hear that, then it may be something best avoided. But it is palpably absurd to suggest that the massive majority of people taking to the streets of London because they are desperate for a cessation of the bombardment of Palestinian civilians are indulging in anything other than a display of compassion and concern. The massive majority. So Suella Braverman called it a hate march. What does she call the protests in Israel about the bombardment of Gaza? Would they be hate marches as well? Or does she just not think that far ahead? She called it a hate march. And I thought, why has she done that then? And we get our answer now, because they have conjured up fears that people poised to protest on Saturday, which is November the 11th, and therefore Armistice Day, Remembrance Day. It's a sort of coincidence of calendar that it arrives on a Saturday. We always have Remembrance Sunday, which is the first Sunday after Armistice Day, I think. But Remembrance Day is November the 11th itself, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, having a particular poignancy because it's when the armistice was called. And there is literally nobody that I am aware of. I've not been able to identify anybody who has revealed an intention to pollute Armistice Day commemorations. But why would they? Why would you be fearful of any disruption of Armistice Day commemorations on Saturday with the Palestinian Solidarity March unfolding elsewhere but nearby in London, unless you either genuinely believed or wanted other people to believe that feeling compassion for the Palestinian victims of bombardment somehow is equivalent to being opposed to commemorating the sacrifice of troops in, all wars. Not just the Second World War, but most obviously the First and Second World War. The First World War being where the poppy emblem comes from. So I think this might be gross. Met Chief urged to ban Armistice Day protest is rhetoric designed to create the idea that people calling for an armistice in Palestine, people calling for an armistice in the Middle East, are behaving inappropriately on a day that we celebrate an armistice in Europe. Now, why would you do that? Unless you either believed or wanted to create the illusion that somehow supporting a cessation of hostilities in the Middle East, no, actually I'm mincing my words too much, wanting the bombing of Gaza to stop as soon as possible means that you must somehow be an enemy of the United Kingdom. Listen, I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. I really do. But who would do that? Who would want to create? Because, look, if someone disrupts the Cenotaph or someone tries to disrupt the Cenotaph, they're scumbags, right? If someone attacks the police, loads of police, 30-odd police were attacked during the Countryside Alliance March. One of them was hospitalised. These are yobs, these are thugs. Every march you ever have will have a thug element. It will have a yob element. But everyone from the Deputy Prime Minister and now Rishi Sunak, they're expressing grave concerns over a planned demonstration on the Saturday, which I think are being deliberately conflated by corners of the media with the traditional commemoration on the Sunday. So there's a smallish celebration on the Saturday, on Remembrance Day itself, or Armistice Day itself. And then on Remembrance Sunday, we have the famous images from the Cenotaph, and we have the famous and very, very powerful speeches and imagery and music that comes from the Cenotaph itself. So 70,000 protesters are expected in the capital on Saturday, the massive majority of whom, I imagine, will be entirely supportive of Remembrance Day and Armistice Day commemorations. So what exactly is happening here? Nobody has professed a desire to disrupt Remembrance Sunday celebrations. When there are big protest marches, statuary gets boarded up. Again, I refer you back to the Countryside Alliance March. Statuary gets boarded up. Statuary, sorry, too many T's. Statuary gets boarded up. So it will happen somewhere, but it won't happen to the Cenotaph because A, the march is not scheduled to go in that direction, and B, everybody will be there commemorating Remembrance Sunday. So Met Chief urged to ban Armistice Day protest. Currently has no intention of doing so. Quite frankly, why would he? 70,000 protesters, hundreds of yards, half a mile away, just trying to get the image in my mind of where the passage will go. And a very deliberate attempt, I think, to cast anybody marching in solidarity with Palestinian civilians as being an enemy or opposed to commemorating the war sacrifice of soldiers. Am I reading this wrong? Is there an interpretation of this that is a little less bleak and a little less grim? I give you another example. Oliver Dowden said that Black Lives Matter activists had failed to speak out about anti-Semitism. How the hell does he know? Has he phoned them up and asked them? It's such a strange thing to say as well. You can't conflate American... I see someone, there were lots of protests about George Floyd, but why aren't the same people protesting about the Hamas terror attacks? And you sort of think, are you really conflating the American police with a murderous death cult? You're suggesting these two things are somehow morally equivalent, or something similar has happened? I often think condemnation of terror attacks is almost a given, but citizens being murdered by police officers is very different from citizens being murdered by terrorists for reasons that are so obvious you'd think even Oliver Dowden could understand them, but apparently not. So And then, of course, you get far-right protests as well, which no one's ever seemed to mention. National Front, thankfully, doesn't exist anymore, but the various organisations that have sprung up in the space that it vacated routinely co-opt the memory of our soldiers' sacrifice to punt their own disgusting ideologies, which are a hell of a lot closer to the ones that we defeated in the Second World War than anything that will be on display in a pro-Palestinian march on Saturday. So why are right-wing media and right-wing politicians, I guess, stopping with Suella Braverman, trying to describe a display of compassion and concern that may have been infiltrated by a tiny minority of scumbags, describing the whole thing as a hate march? Emily interviewed Mark Rowley, the head of the Met, last week, and you could tell his frustration. He said, you'd have to ask her what she's talking about. You'll have to ask her what she's talking about. Why? Why is a peaceful protest on Saturday being used as a source of apparently manufactured concerns about non-peaceful behaviour on Sunday? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. 0345 6060 973. And we are left with one question that may be a bit too simplistic, and please correct me if I am. But if you can't call for an armistice on Armistice Day, then when the hell can you?
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 24 minutes after 12. Looking at the incredible story last week about Keir Starmer's poppy, and then Suella Braverman's decision to describe a march which is essentially calling for peace. Now, you may think it's a misguided call, but that is the motivation of the massive majority of people on these Palestinian solidarity marches. They want the carnage to stop, and they struggle to see any difference in human life according to the star, the sign, the religion you were born under. Suella Braverman decided to call those hate marches, and now we wake up to find that there are calls for one of these marches to be banned because they would be calling for an armistice in the Middle East on the day that we commemorate the armistice in Europe. And I'm just wondering what's going on. Naz is in Enfield. Naz, what do you reckon?
She just wants to divide us, James. She wants to divide the Muslim community from normal British people, because I'm a British-born Muslim. I've always stood for peace. I've always stood against terrorism, and I'm going to go to the march on Saturday, I hope. And I want peace. And she's an Islamophobe. She hates Muslims, Pakistani men. She said they haven't got the same values as us. Invasion.
No, I think that actually the Mail on Sunday became the first newspaper in history that had to apologise for an article written by a Home Secretary when she last weighed into that particular issue. So your opinion is that she's an Islamophobe. It's an opinion shared by a former race advisor to Number 10 Downing Street, who made the point last week, I think. Obviously, I'm sure she'd deny it, but we currently have freedom of speech in this country, so you are free to offer that opinion.
She said invasion. You know, when she says the people from the boats, she demonises them so much. And you know, it seems like to me, now I don't want to be controversial on radio, but she's married to a Zionist Jew. Is that why she hates us? Is that why she thinks that everybody that's on that march are hate marchers?
Those are the words, just for anyone confused, those are the words she has used, I think, to describe.
She used it in an article.
To describe her husband herself. We talked a lot about her in the first hour of the programme on the homelessness issue. So this is about more than just her, although it seems to me that describing people like you as hate marchers when you are marching for peace is very much part of a process that leads to calls for you not to be able to march because of an almost Minority Report style fear that you might suddenly have a rush of blood to the head, or you might have accidentally found yourself alongside people who would have a problem with commemorating Armistice Day.
It's scary to me. It's scary to be in a country now that if you're pro-Palestinian, peaceful people, and it is to me like a Jewish life is worth much more, an Israeli life is worth much more than a Palestinian. That's what it looks like on certain media channels, on TV, and it makes me feel very uncomfortable. But I'm originally from, my parents were from Mauritius, nothing to do with us.
Same with Suella Braverman, I think. Isn't Suella Braverman's mum from Mauritius as well?
Yeah. I'm ashamed about that, actually.
Well, don't be. It's not your fault. It's nothing to do with you. So what do we think is happening here? So I am supposed to think that because you're going on that march, you are opposed to, and then we insert whatever inflammatory phrase is popular today, British values, or our British troops, troops, and you know, and it's so wrong, because if you look at most Muslims, we're diverse. We've got so many friends. We've got, and we're sort of like, even on the homeless. I don't want to bring that up. We have from the mosque. We have food banks. We give. You know. We send trucks to the homeless on Saturdays and nights, and she's trying to demonise. I feel she's. I do too. Actually, I do too. But it isn't just her. So that I do want to steer it. I want to steer it back. Would it be naive of me or silly or just to suggest that if as many people as possible on Saturday wear a poppy, it would end up making her look a little bit ridiculous?
No, I was thinking that.
Yeah.
I was thinking that.
Might be a good idea.
I was thinking that because, you know, my grandchildren, they go on the marches in Wales, in Cardiff.
Right.
They're just 7, you know, some are younger and some are a bit slightly older. But all they're marching for is for peace and justice. That's what we're marching for. We don't want, you know, I'm thankful that the Nazis were defeated.
You shouldn't have to say that. You shouldn't have to say that on the radio. Yeah, all of these people have created a space in which a British Muslim grandmother in Enfield thinks she has to reiterate the fact that she's glad the Nazis were defeated. That right at the end there, unintentionally, I think you've just knocked it out of the park. It's 12:30. Amelia Cox has got your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
12:33 is the time. Conflation is the game. Conflation is the name of the game. So, you know, in the way that after the September the 11th attacks, an enormous amount of effort was put into trying to portray every Muslim in the country, in the world, as sympathetic to the barbarous murderers in Osama bin Laden's gang. It's a deliberate thing, and if you start from a position of racism, then any opportunity to portray everybody as a problem or everybody as an enemy is irresistible. You see it everywhere. You even see it with Polish people and Romanian people. Remember Farage talking about Romanians? They can't resist it. It's what racists do. Always what racists do. So if an idiot defaces or desecrates the cenotaph, the desperation some people will have to think, oh, typical Muslim, they won't even bother pausing to work out whether it is a Muslim or not. But that is what's happening here on a grand scale. But it's government policy almost. It was a chap called Samuel Kasumu, who was Boris Johnson's race advisor, an advisor to Boris Johnson on matters racial, who has said Suella Braverman is unfortunately part of the problem and described her as being probably Islamophobic. This is in response to her calling pro-Palestine rallies, or peace rallies, as I would call them, hate marches. And of course, you know, if you don't want Hamas to stop sending missiles into Israel, then you are not a peace marcher. You are, you know, supportive of military action in the way that many people are supportive of Israel continuing to bombard Gaza. You're not a peace marcher either. But the massive majority are not marching for any reason other than to call for a cessation of the bombardment of Gaza, where, you know, thousands of children have already been killed. 12:35 is the time. So what's happening here? Ray is in High Wycombe. Ray, what would you like to say?
Hey, James, how are you?
Very well, thank you. What's on your mind?
Oh, lots, and I don't even know if I can actually decipher my own thoughts, to be honest. First of all, I'd like to thank you very much for opening up the debate, because I have not heard on any of the mainstream channels, the news channels, even the BBC, of anybody having what I think is rational thought about and how you've articulated
What am I supposed to be worried about is what I'm asking, really.
I think so, yeah. And I think I'm, even when some of what's the complaint? That people are going to exercise their sort of freedoms that were actually fought for, like you said, on Armistice Day. If you're celebrating, an armistice, that's what we're calling for. I've never been on a march before, and I've never called in at LBC either. But
blimey, what a week!
I've been so motivated. I had such a down day yesterday.
I'm sorry.
When there was another sort of news report, and somebody who was Stop the War Coalition was being challenged so hard just because of the words that he was using. I was thinking, but the sentiment is to stop war, stop killing, stop people. Is this in 2023? Is this what we have to resort to?
I don't know. I'm not a big fan of the Stop the War Coalition, so I'd need to know this. I don't want to go into the specific details of the thing that you described now, but there's a little bit more to them than simply what it says on the tin, and there's enough going on with what is ahead of us rather than what is behind us. What if a dozen or more? I guess what I've spent the morning looking for is the source of the concern, and I've failed to find anything that suggests anybody is planning or wants to disrupt Armistice Day. Let alone Remembrance Sunday. And I'll tell you something else interesting, Ray. Quite a few people have been in touch making the same point, is that until we did the introduction and explained what was going on here, people actually, here's a good one from Mimi. I consider myself actively engaged in politics, James, and even I didn't know that the march was on the Saturday rather than Remembrance Sunday.
Exactly.
The government and the media is deliberately making it sound like the march is planned for Remembrance Sunday.
Agreed. And what I'd heard was that the protest, the march was not going to go anywhere near the Cenotaph.
And it's scheduled to start. Okay. It's scheduled to start 2 hours after the Armistice commemoration ceremony. So everywhere you turn, the question of what we're supposed to be worried about, everybody up to the Prime Minister and the front page of national newspapers is telling us it needs to be banned because of concerns. What are the concerns? What are they based on?
And where do they come from? And why? I mean, and I'm not going to lie. Over the last few weeks, I've been quite scared. So I know Jewish community, and I feel for them. They must be sick and tired of living with this stress all the time. That of the history and what people might be thinking, or if certain words get said and how they it can impact them. But I'm scared.
Yeah.
I'm scared of the future. I said to my daughter the other day, I said, do we need to start taking our money out of our banks and sort of making sure that we're sort of financially safe and stuff like that?
Only if you're on benefits, because they're going to be checking them to make sure that you're not squirreling away savings or something. I've forgotten what that story was. And I just got lots of things popping into my mind at the moment. I'm thinking of the Countryside Alliance March, which was a lot more violent than any of the pro-Palestinian.
Yeah.
And didn't someone out of Pink Floyd's son get jailed for dangling from the Cenotaph not long ago?
That's right. And also, what about marches? You're kind of protesting for something, but you have Notting Hill every year, and I love it. But you have murders there. That doesn't get banned.
I missed that last bit. Where do you have murders?
At Notting Hill, the Notting Hill Carnival,
Yes.
And you have all sorts of unsavoury stuff going on there.
And they don't ban that. Although I think the same people that are calling for this march to be banned would probably be the same people who do actually call for the Notting Hill march to be banned. So I don't know how helpful that observation is, but I take your point when it comes to violence. I prefer the Countryside Alliance, I think, as a comparison, because they are marches and causes as opposed to street carnivals. But the double, triple, quadruple standards, whatever you want to call it. 20 to 1 is the time. Jane is in Bermondsey. Jane, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I think they're just using it cynically as a wedge issue. I think they've behaved so badly as a government that they have no leg to stand on. So what they're trying to do is just stir up problems and hatred on issues like this. And I'd also like to say, I think it's very insulting to assume that the the Armistice, etc., is just for white people.
Do you think that's the subtext? Well, Suella Braverman's not. She's from an ethnic minority, of course, but there is something in play.
Using anything, it would be gays, lesbian, whatever next. And I really think it's insulting because loads of Commonwealth soldiers and soldiers from India and Pakistan lost their lives.
1.5 million Muslims alone were killed in action.
Yeah, in the First and Second World War.
That's just the second one. So the numbers. I mean, how do we commemorate them? If calling for people in Palestine not to be killed somehow puts you at odds with people commemorating the sacrifices made in the world wars and other wars. But some estimates put the number of Muslims that fought on the Allied side in World War II at 5.5 million.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think it's a real insult to assume that those people, you don't want to honour their dead as much as we want to honour ours.
I'd be honest with you, if it wasn't for the poppy last week, I don't know that I would have done this as because I just thought that's so obviously. But I mean, how desperate do you have to be to malign Keir Starmer, to pretend that he took off his poppy for fear of offending Muslims without being able to explain why wearing a poppy would have offended Muslims? I mean, it's just frankly bizarre. And yet here we are looking now at a much bigger story, calls to ban, as if 700,000 people are all somehow diametrically opposed to the commemoration of the war dead, the Allied war. Well, it's not just the Allied war dead, is it? If you would take it in its purest form, then the Remembrance Sunday would remember and commemorate everybody's death, every soldier that dies in conflict. 12:42 is the time. It's a strange old business. Laura's in Camden. Laura, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Well, I'm a bit nervous for starters, but I'll because I feel like we could disagree on this, so I'm getting prepared to be shouted at.
Well, I don't shout, Laura, but I obviously.
So, I guess my point is that Armistice Day, to me, and I think it's generally accepted, feels like it's a representation of fight and an end against fascistic behaviour, against, and especially at the end of the World War II, of the rise of Nazism and the killing of 6 million Jews. And it's a special day, not only for me as a British Jew, but me as a British citizen. And frankly, there does feel an incongruence between the two.
I don't want to jump in earlier.
Yeah.
But I mean, the significance of Remembrance Day is directly linked to the end of the First World War in 1919. Yeah. So that's the significance of the date and the moment and the time and the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, long before Hitler's rise, long before the Nazis even existed. But I fully appreciate your interpretation of the events, but I just need to clarify that historically that's not the case.
Yeah, and I'll accept that.
It's not really a question of accepting it, is it?
Well,
it just is.
True, right?
Yes.
It's true. But to me, and as I said, disclosing the fact I'm a British Jew, I've already got certain intimidation issues about these protests.
Of course, I can understand that.
So it feels to me like there is a certain element, and I know it's a minority, but there is a certain element that feels to me like it's a very radical element of some of the people that go on these marches that are celebrating dead Jews, dead lives, and not just Jews, but the idea
that would be utterly unacceptable, and it would be a crime. So, I don't want to put you on the spot, but out of 70,000 protesters, how many would you realistically malign in that way or describe in that way?
I don't know, but I would say
because remember the ones you're not putting in that category would be banned from making their peaceful.
Well,
protest.
It wouldn't be banned. It could be postponed, right? So my point is that
no, Saturday's march would be banned. You can't postpone Saturday's march. Okay, it just becomes a march on another day.
Yeah, there isn't. If you say the word banned, it sounds like it's never going to happen again, and I don't think that's.
I'm just reading the front of the Telegraph. I'm using the language that the politicians are using.
All right, so we'll say it's been banned, right? But there is a minority, as we know, of people that are, at least, if I'm being charitable, confused about thinking about their thinking around this, right? Yeah. They conflate various issues, and to me,
maybe, but you just conflated the end of the Second World War with the end of the First World War. It's not a crime, is it?
I don't think it's quite as serious a crime as conflation with support for,
but then we'd need to establish how many of those 70,000 could be reasonably accused of that. I do understand your position, but I think you'll probably be surprised to discover that you think it's reasonable to call for a temporary cessation of peaceful protests, but not a temporary cessation of the bombardment of Gaza.
Well, I would actually. I would call for a temporary cessation of the bombardment.
Well, then there's a march you can go on Saturday.
No, but just I think my point is that all I seem to have forgotten now, because we're talking about the bombardment at Gaza, and now I've just got all these images of children going through my head.
Me too.
Yeah, sorry. So, I don't think that is this protest just about calling for ceasefire? Is that what they're calling?
Well, then
for?
you can only the people on it can answer that question. And my belief is,
my point is, there's a massive mixed element. And if I were organising this, if I were part of the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, just even as a PR exercise, I would say, you know what, guys, let's do it the following Saturday. Let's show everyone that.
Well, I've got someone from that campaign on next, but just to clarify, the bombs would continue to drop. But the march calling
whether or not the march goes ahead,
I have to finish. The bombs would continue to drop, but the march calling for it to stop should be postponed.
Correct.
Okay. I mean, at least that's clarity. I can't complain about your clarity. I find that incomprehensible in logical and moral terms, but I'm grateful to you for your honesty. It's 12:47.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
10:01 is the time. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. It was completely coincidental that Laura just mentioned the Palestine Solidarity Campaign in the UK, when in response to me pointing out that you would have to ask people marching why they are marching, and I remain. It was a good mannered exchange, a respectful exchange, but I do find something a little incongruous or incomprehensible about the idea of wanting to postpone calls for the bombing to stop while the bombing continues. I just do. And you could even elevate that to the observation, which I didn't come up with myself, I've seen it elsewhere over the weekend, of calling for an armistice on Armistice Day has apparently become controversial. But maybe there are things that we should be concerned about. Maybe there are substantive, meaningful grounds for these calls from right-wing media and some very right-wing politicians to ban a call for an armistice on Armistice Day. Ben Jamal is a director of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign in the UK, and therefore has probably been following this curious story even more closely than the rest of us. Where do the worries come from, Ben? Do we know the concern that there may be a disruption or a defilement or a desecration? What is the source of these fears?
Yeah, good afternoon, James. I mean, look, the honest answer I have to give you, because I think there may be members of the public who have a genuine concern about that, but I think where's that coming from? It's coming from deeply irresponsible, and I'm being polite, I think, but deeply irresponsible comments from political leaders, most notably the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary, who jointly have put out statements to say that this march should not take place because it is going to create a risk of desecrating the cenotaph. Now, look, to put context on this, since all of this escalation of violence began, but since the beginning of Israel's campaign of indiscriminate bombing of Gaza, and your listeners will know that's now killed nearly 10,000 Palestinians, including over 4,500 children, we have been marching regularly. And normally we march on a Saturday. That's really a sort of traditional day for a march, when you can get as many people as possible who want to come and make their voices heard. And what we're marching for, we're calling for a ceasefire. We're calling for an end to this indiscriminate bombing. There is an additional message as well, which is we are asking for the root causes of this to be addressed. And that means really seriously addressing the ongoing military occupation. Now, we some time ago made clear, so whenever we're organising this, we're bringing hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people to the streets. We always liaise with the police, because you need to do that to ensure public safety. Roads, etc., have to be closed. From the very beginning of those discussions, as we mapped forward that these would likely continue, we indicated that on November the 11th, because traditionally we march near Whitehall, we normally would try and also march to Hyde Park. Hyde Park is not available at the moment as a destination because of Winter Wonderland. we made clear we would not want to march near Whitehall on November the 11th. Our rationale for that, we know, and there's been some really disingenuous sort of comments suggesting that the main commemorations take place on the Saturday. We all know, I was born and bred in this country. The remembrance service at the Cenotaph always takes place on the Sunday.
That's a deliberate conflation.
We didn't want to disrupt preparations for that. So
Sure.
we made clear, the police knew that. Now, unless we're led to believe that the Prime Minister and Home Secretary hasn't been talking to the police, which I would find pretty extraordinary, given that the police know, and given that the police have been in agreement and mapping out with us, agreeing the route of the march, which is well away from central London, and we are not marching also. Of course, what happens on November the 11th is the 2-minute silence.
Yes.
We're not marching till way after that. The idea that marching well away from the centre of London after the 11 o'clock 2-minute silence, is somehow a threat to the Cenotaph and is going to desecrate the Cenotaph is a grotesque argument, and it's designed really to smear those who are marching and suppress public support for a ceasefire, which stands at 76%. So that's where it's coming from. And as I think I heard you say in your previous comments, there's something I think morally grotesque about an argument that it's okay, because the people making this argument about the march are the people calling that there should be no ceasefire. So it's okay for the bombs to keep falling, but it's not okay for people to protest that indiscriminate bombing.
I didn't use the word grotesque, but I could have done. What about the rogue element in a march? If 70,000 people turn up, then we have seen people essentially celebrating Hamas's terror attacks. We've seen small numbers of people. I mean, there are some live legal cases, so we have to be careful what we say. But it is, and there have been some anti-Semitic banners and posters, and there have been some grim shouts and chants. So there is a small contingency who may be opposed to what is represented on November the 11th and this week on November the 10th.
Yeah, and look, it's worth saying, I mean, the police always give estimates to the march. I think anyone who organises a march will know that the police estimates are always way lower than the actual figure. But even by the police estimates, I think the police have estimated that in entire British history, there's only been 10 marches of more than 100,000 people, but they've estimated two of ours to be 100,000.
Yes. So you're saying it's a heck of a lot more than that, which makes the percentage question even more pertinent. But
it does.
But let me read you, because we're going to run out of time. Let me read you something. Yeah. So it is understood that Metropolitan Police officers are especially worried about a public backlash if they are forced to detain veterans who clash with protesters. Do you have, Benjamin, the first inkling where that comes from?
No idea, and I'm not sure, because we're marching from Marble Arch on the Saturday, not the Sunday, to the US Embassy, which people will know as in Vauxhall. So I'm not sure why there would be. Why would veterans be gathering in Vauxhall? That doesn't make any sense to me. And as I said, this idea of public disorder. Of course, we over the 3 to 4 weeks we brought well over 1 million people. I think in total across that, I think there's been about 40 arrests, 40 to 50 arrests, which is an extraordinarily low figure. And of course, at the fringes, some people have been arrested for saying things or carrying placards that are an offence. And that's for the police to take action and for those to be investigated. We're very clear on the principles on which we're marching. And they are clear anti-racist principles. Nobody who's coming to say anything racist or chant anything racist belongs at our marches. But those are really, really tiny proportions. And the attempt to say, look, there were these 3 placards or these 4 placards in a huge crowd is a way of defining the entire crowd is really at best dubious.
Some people might dispute 3 or 4 in the context of that conversation, but a tiny minority of the overall is the point that you're making. Ben Jamal, Director of Palestine Solidarity Campaign in the UK, thank you. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back to the whole show podcast on Global Player, where you can also pause and rewind live radio. You'll also find all of LBC's shows to catch up on, as well as the world's biggest podcasts. Pause and rewind live radio on Global Player, where you're always in control. Download for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick, but now she's always in control.
I think Always in Control has overtaken Rewind Live Radio.
Rewind Live Radio?
In your Intonation Top 10, yeah. Thank you, James.
I don't know what you mean.
I think you do.
James O'Brien on LBC.